So some of you may know I had an exchange a few months ago with a right-wing libertarian slash ANCAP user by the name of Bad Mouse Productions. However, on International Workers' Day, he very appropriately made the following announcement.
After a huge amount of deliberation and a huge amount of research and a huge amount of mental trauma, I have come to the decision that I can no longer support capitalism.
That's great news, and it's a great example of how people really can change their minds and move from one end of the spectrum to the other if they really do take the time out to consider new information. He's also come out in support of feminism, which I think is really commendable and fantastic news. However, as his audience consists mostly of ANCAPs, until now obviously, he will probably face quite a backlash if he starts making anti-capitalist content. Even more so if he starts making feminist content. So do him a favour and go and check out his channel. Anyway, a month or so ago he made an open letter video to Anarcho-Communists. And although he's converted to socialism now, I'd still like to respond to the questions that he brought up, because they're very frequently asked. So without further ado, let us begin the Anarcho-Communist FAQ.
Would I have to feel annoyed with the gear that I have bought from other companies if I was an anarcho-communist?
This is a bit of a strange question, and it's not entirely clear to me what you're getting at. However, one way of looking at it is being annoyed with what you're buying going to advance any kind of social change? Personally, I don't think it does, and I've never really been convinced by so-called ethical shopping as a strategy for change, for a number of reasons. First of all, irrespective of what company you buy from, there will always be some degree of exploitation in order for the company to make a profit and survive in the marketplace. This is true even of ethical companies. Secondly, not many people have the time to figure out the most ethical way to buy their products, especially when hundreds of different companies can collaborate in the making of just one product. Thirdly, not only is it really time consuming to actually figure out the most ethical way to shop, but also not very many people actually have the money to act upon their ethical preferences. Often so-called ethical products have prices that are well out of the reach of most ordinary people. Finally, even if people do manage to buy ethically, ultimately it doesn't change very much, because these people will be in a small minority if most people can't actually afford the more ethical products. When it comes to ethical consumerism, ultimately you're looking at investing a massive amount of time and energy into something which is only going to be accessible to a small minority of people, and is going to bring amounts of change which are infinitesimally small. So, unless you're talking about organised, coordinated boycotts, I don't see much point in it, other than to stroke the egos of middle-class liberals.
Do all ANCOMs believe in the Labour theory of value?
A lot of ANCOMs do, but not everyone. Personally, although economics aren't my specialty, I'm inclined to agree with the Labour theory of value, mainly because if workers go on strike and withdraw their labour for long enough, then the bosses can go out of business. Strike action is effective because it cuts off the source of the boss's profits, and that to me suggests that labour is the source of value. I recommend watching Kapitalism 101, that's Capitalism with a K by the way, on YouTube, which has a lot of good refutations to objections to the Labour theory of value, especially the so-called mud pie argument.
Could I still give to charity?
Of course, but some charities can actually be quite dodgy. Capitalist philanthropy is often used as a smokescreen where rich people will say, "Oh, I couldn't possibly be exploiting anybody, look at all my charity work." Also, it's important to remember that charity is a very individualised way of dealing with social problems. Solidarity and mutual support, as advocated by anarchists, are much more empowering for people in vulnerable situations because they're actually based on community and self-help, rather than relying on someone who has more money than you.
Do all ANCOMs support feminism?
In my opinion, all consistent anarchists should support feminism. There are many countries around the world today, including our own, in which women are denied access to reproductive health care, in which women are the targets of sexual violence and domestic abuse, and both men and women are expected to adhere to patriarchal social norms that prevent people from expressing themselves, and so have no place in a decent society. Anarchism is for everybody, and that includes women and non-binary people. We should support unconditionally the right of oppressed people to resist their oppression in whatever way they see fit. Patriarchy is a real problem, and it should be smashed.
Do ANCOMs agree with taxes?
not as an ideal but as a temporary measure that can to some extent alleviate inequality and provide social services like the NHS for working class people. While we don't support tax-funded services as an ideal to aspire to, we recognise the fact that today we live in a capitalist system, and a capitalist system in which there is no welfare state is one in which the balance of power is very much tipped in favour of the bosses. When there's no social safety net, there's much more fear of unemployment, and so without a welfare state, workers will be less willing to take risks and go on strike.
Would Anarchons agree that even though they find capitalism to be evil, would they agree that in the relative sphere, in the freest areas where capitalism has been able to get there, it has elevated the standard of living exponentially in comparison to the feudal living which only created enough to survive?
In comparison to feudalism, capitalism is definitely much more productive. However, I would contest that the free market is responsible for it. Most developed capitalist countries around the world today use state intervention to get there. And the IMF forcing developing countries to adopt free market policies seems like a remarkable way to actually keep them in the third world. Most importantly though, although capitalism is arguably an extremely productive system, ultimately it's the workers who produce the riches. And all too often these riches end up in the hands of just a few people, and the environment gets destroyed. And the question is, how can we still increase our quality of life, but without all of the inequalities and environmental destruction? And that's where socialism comes in.
Do most ANCOMs support Greenpeace?
This mostly varies depending on who you speak to. Personally, I'm not too keen on Greenpeace. While I support their single-issue campaigns against nuclear weapons and climate change, I disagree with their stance on nuclear power and genetic engineering.
If I am like Michael Moore and I say that I hate capitalism and criticise it all the time, yet make loads and loads of money through my enterprises and my businesses and so forth, am I being a hypocrite?
If you criticise capitalism and yet you own means of production and you have the power to hire and fire people, then yes, I would say you're a hypocrite.
Do you agree with the minimum wage, even though it hurts some workers who don't have enough skills?
I agree with the minimum wage as a temporary measure within a capitalist system. In fact, I support a living wage, and I disagree with the premise of the question that it hurts unskilled workers. Contrary to neoliberal doctrine, there are numerous studies showing that increasing the minimum wage has little to no effect on employment.
What are your thoughts on trigger warnings on campuses and trigger warnings in general?
I think they're understandable. The point of a trigger warning is to say, we're going to talk about something which can be very upsetting for people, especially those who have had traumatic experiences. So here's your warning. I don't have any problem with that. It seems very reasonable and compassionate as far as I'm concerned.
Do you like Che Guevara?
Not particularly, no. While Batista's regime was awful and should have been overthrown, it should not have been replaced with party dictatorship. Che was a Leninist, and according to Sam Dolgoff, what came of the so-called revolution in Cuba was the government bureaucracy crushing the organs of workers' control.
Do you like Russell Brand?
This depends on who you ask, but if you're asking me, personally, no, I'm not too fond of him. Also, you can read the Anarchist Federation's statement about Russell Brand on Libcom.
If I were to become an anarcho-communist, would I have to disown and, despise all of my favourite libertarian bloggers and speakers like Julie Borowski, Larkin Rose, Jeff Tucker, in a very sympathetic way, Milton Friedman, and so forth if I became an anarcho-communist?
It's not that you have to, but if you commit yourself to socialist ideas, you will probably develop a distaste for them of your own accord. Especially Milton Friedman, who was an advisor to Pinochet, who ran a brutal dictatorship in Chile, backed up by American state and corporate interests. Friedman has also helped to propagate the neoliberal ideology and economic system, which has crushed organisations of working class power with police violence and carried out a massive redistribution of wealth to an elite minority, which is completely antithetical to socialist values of freedom and equality. Also, if you check out Anarcho-Pact's channel, you'll find a number of videos exposing the philosophical and practical problems inherent to right-wing libertarianism. You can still watch bloggers like Larkin Rose, Jeff Tucker and Julie Borowski if you want, but they're coming from a standpoint which really is all over the place. Philosophically, it's full of holes and often morally counterintuitive. Practically, it's neither feasible nor desirable, and ultimately it doesn't really exist outside of the internet. internet. The Free Domain radio community is not only disturbing, cultish, and full of strange reactionaries, but also Stefan Molyneux is a very slimy, manipulative, and narcissistic man whose practical suggestions for advancing his cause are not only hopelessly ineffective, but also psychologically damaging. It's not that you're not allowed to follow some of these people, it's just, why would you, when you could instead be following someone like Noam Chomsky, who's done far more to challenge power and to advance popular movements than someone like Jeff Tucker. David Graeber is also a committed activist and entertaining speaker on the libertarian left. Nocturnus Libertus is an anarcho-feminist who blogs regularly about black autonomy and gender politics. You could also check out IMO Bastani on Novara Media, where Aaron Bastani gives regular libertarian communist analysis of current events in the UK. All of these people are very much worth listening to. On the one hand, you have people who want to organise the masses and agitate for social change that takes power out of the hands of state and corporate bureaucrats and into the hands of ordinary people. And on the other hand, you have red pill philosophy and Bitcoin.
Do I have to condone the use of violence in certain scenarios, even though it's not being directly initiated upon me? As I am against aggressing violence because I find it the easiest and most consistent way to stand by.
You don't have to. You can be an anarcho-pacifist if you like. However, I personally am very sceptical of the notion that capitalists and statesmen will voluntarily give up all of their power and property to the working class, considering the fact that right now they seem very intent on defending it with heavily militarized police. The compromise is that it's justified to initiate violence against institutions which are a threat to human freedom or the preconditions to human freedom. Remember, they do have tanks.
How do we deal with stuff like, high in demand, high skilled jobs like surgeons who might not necessarily want to do it if no money incentive is there to propel them to do it?
Under communism, goods and services are distributed according to need rather than one's contribution. What this means is that everyone is free to take whatever goods and services they need from communal stores, irrespective of their contribution of work. And one objection to this is that nobody will want to do any work which is boring or particularly difficult, because their needs will be satisfied either way. But this objection is very flawed. First of all, it's based on this homo economicus view of human nature. Capitalist economics tend to view human beings as atomized individuals who seek to produce as little as possible and to consume as much as possible, and so they will only work if you incentivize them with carrots and sticks. However, a look at empirical evidence shows this to be nothing more than an economic myth. In the 1970s, an experiment was held in Dauphin, Canada, where everyone was guaranteed a basic level of income. Although the number of hours worked decreased very slightly, the only people who worked significantly less were new mothers who wanted to spend more time with their children, and teenagers who were under less pressure to support their families. More teenagers graduated, and there was an increase in the number of adults continuing education. In one of Michael Albert's talks on participatory economics, he had an exchange with someone to see how low he could drop their salary for being a surgeon until they then decided to switch to a much higher paid job in a coal mine. And he essentially managed to drop their salary far lower than the coal mine job, right up until the surgeon's salary became far too low to live on. What this shows is that so long as it's work that they actually want to do, people will accept a lower salary for particularly difficult work, so long as it's just enough for them to live on. Also, during the Spanish Revolution, the anarchists were quite successful in providing healthcare for people under the socialist system. Barcelona's medical syndicate managed 18 hospitals, 6 of which it had created, 17 sanatoria, 22 clinics, 6 psychiatric establishments, 3 nurseries, and 1 maternity hospital. Doctors and nurses made up over half of the anarchist health workers union, which had a membership of about 8,000. In terms of menial work, anarchists would set about dealing with this in 3 ways. First of all, by using the available technology to automate as much menial work as possible. Secondly, by making the workplace a more appealing place to be by giving workers control and ownership over their own work. And obviously this is something that would be applied to all work. And thirdly, by sharing the menial work collectively amongst everyone who's capable of doing it, so that the contributions required of individuals are minimized as much as possible. The contributions required of individuals could be minimised further by the fact that many bureaucratic jobs could simply be abolished under anarchism, so more people would be available.
Unions. What are your feelings on unions in sort of standing up for workers' rights and in response to that also sort of jeopardizing everybody else in a sense as well, Winter of 79 and all that?
There are varied perspectives on unions, although most anarchists would probably agree that mainstream trade unions tend to be quite bureaucratic and act as an intermediary between labour and capital. Sometimes union bosses end up doing deals with management that enrich themselves and stab the rank and file in the back. Mainstream trade unions also have a tendency to declaw workers' militancy through A to B marches that don't really go anywhere. Anarchists will tend to be more enthusiastic about unions that don't piss their money away on political parties and are controlled by the rank and file in a horizontal, direct democracy, without any paid bureaucratic officials. An example of a more anarchistic trade union would be something like the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies, of which I'm clearly a member. Anarchists are also very supportive of workers' struggles that are undertaken independently of unions. That is, wildcat actions where workers will carry out workplace sabotage or strike or occupy independently of what union officials might want them to do. Even still, we always support strike action, even if it's undertaken by unions that aren't our favourite. We take it as a point of principle never to cross a picket line. With regard to the winter of discontent, there are two things to bear in mind here. First of all, it could have easily been avoided. The public sector workers were forced to take strike action because they were facing years of unnecessary pay cuts to keep down inflation. But contrary to what many Thatcherites claim, the inflationary crisis was not caused by unions pushing up wages. In fact, there was a massive wave of inflation going on throughout the Western world, caused as a result of the US printing massive sums of money to pay for the increasingly costly and immoral Vietnam War. Secondly, strikes are disruptive for a reason. These workers were arbitrarily being made to face a sharp decline in their living standards because of a crisis that they didn't have any part in creating. Strikes draw attention to the fact that, in this system, when things go tits up, ordinary people are often arbitrarily penalised for problems that are caused by politicians and rich people. The assault on unions that followed in the Thatcherite era caused far-reaching social damage. Destroyed communities, lack of job security, rising drug addiction and violence. This kind of damage is far more destructive than some disruption caused by strike action in the service of just causes.
I make films in my spare time. Would I be able to hierarchically control the production of that film with other people and pay them to do it for me?
In terms of having specifically creative control over the production of a film, I don't see how that would be a problem so long as everybody involved is taking part through free agreement and rational authority is as far as it goes. However, paying people to do it sounds a bit strange because a communist economic system isn't based on market mechanisms, so you don't have a wage system or a money system through which to pay people. If you were to have a mutualist system where you get rid of the bosses but keep the market, you would still sell films on the market for money, but the distribution of the income generated from this would have to be decided democratically by everybody affected by the decision.
Why are there so many few housing cooperatives? Because I quite like the idea of a housing cooperative, but I can't seem to find one, and I'd really like to find one, and I can't, and I'd like to go into one for my next year at uni.
Housing cooperatives, and co-ops in general for that matter, are somewhat rare because we live in a capitalist system, and under capitalism it's the norm for a few individuals to own giant factories that they don't work in and giant housing estates that they don't live in, and to gain financially from the people who actually do work in the factories and live in the houses. As a result of this, the vast majority of people are not allowed to experience meaningful freedom in the places where they live and work, the places where they spend most of their time even, rather than get the psychological and social benefits of running a participatory community with their friends and comrades. And this is why I think the capitalist system is basically a giant waste of human potential. However, although they are a minority, the co-op movement is growing, with 1 billion people worldwide being involved in cooperatives. And if you'd like that number to increase, then I would urge you to try to find some like-minded people to set up a cooperative of your own. I also recommend checking out Radical Roots, and they can show you, with some fairly digestible literature how to set up workers' co-ops and housing co-ops. Anyway, that concludes my response to this open letter to anarcho-communists. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks very much to Bad Mouse Productions for making his video. I'm really sorry that it took me so long to respond. I've been really busy. Go and check out Bad Mouse Productions' channel, as he now identifies as a social anarchist and a feminist, so he will be coming under a lot of fire. Anyway, thanks very much for watching this video. For more anarchist content, subscribe to Libertarian Socialist Rants and Anarchist Collective. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.